switch back to turn off the video. And can everyone see the PowerPoint slides?
Yes, we can see them, Sue Ann, and I'll introduce you, and then I'll turn it over to you. Aaron says he can't see the slides, but he's fine. So I sent your PowerPoint to Aaron ahead of time so he can follow along as well. So as all of you know from the email communication, Sue Ann is the product manager at the Diagram Center, which is a research and development hub launched by Benetech. And she has lots of expertise in the area of complex image accessibility. I've had the good fortune to listen to many of her presentations at Accessing Higher Ground, which we virtually stream into the University of Montana, and then also to attend her CSUN presentations in San Diego. So, Sue Ann, welcome to the Montana Accessibility Interest Group, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation, Marlene. So I think if Curtis had a question about recording, so I don't know.
Yes, this is being recorded, and I'll post it on the Montana Accessibility Interest Group website after we finish today.
Okay, great. So this is a session that pretty similar to what's coming up at Accessing Higher Ground later this month, so you guys get a nice preview into some of the work that the Diagram Center and Benetech's been working on the past year. And Brian Gold, who's with us today, has been very integral in a lot of production of a lot of this content, so it's great to have him here. So I'm going to just dive right in and start the presentation. And okay. Okay, so a picture is worth 1,000 words, and we all know how important images can be when you're talking about something like a picture book. What you will notice on screen is a picture of a book from Chrysanthemum, which is a children's book, and it has accompanying a lot of text, but as we know, for a child who's learning, and if someone is visually impaired and blind and not able to access the image, there's a lot of critical content that's missed for a young child. Similarly, there's a lot of content found in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, math, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, that is very critical to learning for a student. There's a lot of very complicated images in biology and a lot of the higher level education content in particular, as well as liberal arts, which I'm sure Brian eventually will be talking about in his session, that require image descriptions, but it's not always easy to do. There's also a lot of content such as mathematic and symbolic notations. So for example, math equations, chemical elements and equations, physics, music. There's a lot of special notations out there for different disciplines. And without access to that content, a lot of critical information is again lost. And here are just a few different places where different types of content needs to be made available. We have increasingly, especially in the digital world, more videos coming on board. And there are also additionally more interactive simulations and games, particularly with online education testing. A lot of times there's interactives, and these things need to be made available. And then there's a whole host of content even beyond what we already know today. This is a photo in particular of somebody playing. It's like a virtual reality. I'm not even quite sure what they're doing, but it's like a virtual reality, and they're playing the piano. Where we can't even know what's coming on, but we need to make these different forms of learning available and to everyone. So regardless of need, we need to make all of this content accessible. So that's sort of an introduction to what I will be talking about today. So the Diagram Center community has been around for about 5 years. Brian Gold's actually a very key member these past 5 years. And this is a photo that was taken about maybe a year and a half ago in Airlie, where we had about 40 different individuals from various organizations, educators, accessibility specialists, technologists, just a variety of different folks coming together and really thinking of and trying to address the increasing needs and the growing challenges with new technology emerging and how to make content accessible. When the Diagram Center first started 5 years ago, and Diagram stands for Digital Image and Graphics Resources for Accessible Materials, it basically was to address how to make images found in STEM content available. And recently we received a 5-year grant from the Department of Education to continue the work, but what we're trying to do is not only make it easier, faster, and cheaper to make images accessible, but traditionally we were working a lot with print-disabled individuals, and now we're expanding it to a broader audience of students and children with various types of disabilities, such as autism and learning disabilities and beyond. So in the next 5 years, it's going to be a partnership between Benetech and the U.S. Fund for DAISY, but continuing and actually growing the collaboration with a lot of side projects with NCAM on videos and various other organizations to figure out how best to make content available for the community and available in an open source manner globally. So you can learn more about the Diagram Center. I'm not sure if folks have heard about it, but you can definitely learn more at diagramcenter.org, which the link is provided at the bottom. So, basic image accessibility. When we started 5 years ago, we were basically, again, talking about image accessibility, and about 3 years ago, we came out with a proof of concept called Poet, and it's an image description tool that basically tries to make it simpler and easier for people to mark up books with images that require additional descriptions. So on screen right now is a screenshot of Poet where basically a book is uploaded into Poet, and this is a tool, a web-based tool for EPUB 3 and DAISY files. Excuse me. And what happens is the tool will parse out and basically identify whenever there's an image in the particular file. And then on the right side, it'll give you a space to say, okay, this is what type of image, and it'll ask you to identify it, and then give you a space to basically enter in a description. So the idea behind this is that with EPUB, with DAISY, and all these different formats, currently Poet does only support those 2 formats, there's a lot of changing best practice standards. So when reading systems and browsers need to be able to access this content, it needs to be accessed in a way that it can be recognized. So rather than have everyone constantly have to keep up with evolving standards and maybe best practices that are really quite complex and can be technical, what we try to do is leverage a tool that allows people to basically upload a book and start writing. And what we did initially is we were also thinking that it could be a crowdsourced tool, so opening it up to various volunteers. We actually worked with a couple of universities to crowdsource descriptions as well. So trying to match people up with their expertise in physics and science or whatever psychology it is that they have subject matter expertise in, and have students and volunteers go in and write descriptions. So the idea behind Poet was really to leverage a community, because we know that there's so much content out there that needs accessibility, and perhaps they're not created that way initially and needs a lot of retrofitting later on to do so. And so that's started with Poet. And then again, on the next slide is basically the challenges behind accessibility that I just mentioned. So what we know is that once we started doing a lot of these, what we called image slams with volunteers and various partner organizations, we found that people were having a lot of challenges. We had a lot of the best practices that NCAM had created nearly, I want to say 10 years ago, Brian. And And so there were some standards around, okay, well, if you see a pie chart, how do you go about writing a description? But people still had a lot of trouble. And so what we did was a couple years ago, we went back and we surveyed a lot of people who were volunteering and working with us. And what we found was that there were kind of challenges for image descriptions that fell into three buckets. One was around expertise, so whether that means subject matter expertise, accessibility and standards knowledge, or, and also people with varying levels of expertise in these areas. So it was very difficult to have a group of folks who are all on the same page and going in and volunteering and writing these descriptions. Another area that people found that was really challenging was really the time and cost required to write these descriptions. So whether that means looking for references and best practice examples on how to go about writing these descriptions. So, for example, if you were to write a description of a Louvre for a child who is 10 versus a student who is perhaps in an architecture or graduate degree program, that description would be very difficult. So how do you go about addressing the needs of different audiences was a big question. The time and cost required to produce the content itself is also very costly. So if we think back to some of the STEM content where there's elaborate flow diagrams and biology content, it's very difficult to describe those images, and a lot of times it takes a significant amount of time to do so in an adequate way. And then also one of the big challenges when it is not born accessible and it needs to be retrofitted at a later stage, it actually has a limited reach too. So perhaps a book that was created by a publisher, that biology book, let's say, and originally had all these image descriptions available, would have been available to a lot of different people. But if the University of Montana said, oh, I have a particular student that needs access to a particular book and the content within it, that limited retrofitting process is only available to the students in the University of Montana and not available to others. So really, retrofitting is not ideal. And then there's also the question of user-centric resources and guidelines. We want to have a broad range of image types and best practices. So if somebody's going about explaining a bar chart versus a map versus a pie graph or Venn diagram, the process and the approach is going to be very different, and you want to have examples and best practices for each one of those that people can follow. And then a couple years ago when we started, there was really, NCAM had created some great examples and best practices, but it was a little bit limited. There was probably about a dozen or so different examples, and we really wanted to expand those resources and make it easier and user-centric so people could know how to keep up with constantly evolving types of images and technologies as well. So those were the challenges that we were up against even just a couple years ago, and still are actually today. And as we continue to, sorry about that, build more resources, this is the type of things that we're considering. So I'm going to pause there and kind of give people a chance to, are there any questions at this point, or is that a kind of a good introduction to where we are? Okay, I'm going to keep going. So on screen now, and Brian's going to be excited to see this because these are kind of new, I'm actually showing prototypes of things that we're continuing to work on. So last year, we started to create a training module for image descriptions that is sitting on Poet. And I'm going to actually enter in the link into this chat room. So on diagram.herokuapp.com is a Poet tool. And within that tool or that website, you'll also find a training module at the top that we're starting to build out. So what we're trying to do is address some of the commonly asked questions that people have when it comes to writing image descriptions. So in this training module, which we started about a year ago, we started to provide a basic introduction to why and build awareness as to why image accessibility and descriptions are important. So This prototype that you'll see on the screen is basically building upon that, giving additional resources, including the accessible image sample book and the Diagram Center website, which I'll talk about in a little bit, giving links to those and giving an introduction to folks who are new about the importance of image accessibility. And then one thing that is also already there is sort of one of the big questions we often get from people is, when is it necessary to describe an image? And it's not every image that requires a description. Some images, maybe the surrounding content already addresses what is contained in the image. Sometimes maybe an image is actually just eye candy. It's just a placeholder that doesn't actually have any additional value that needs to be addressed. So there are various times where image descriptions are necessary, and sometimes actually image descriptions might not even be sufficient to describing an image. So for example, if you have a map and you're talking about the perimeter of a map, that is very difficult for someone to be able to understand from an image description. But there are additional modalities such as tactile graphics and 2D raised reproductions that basically can give more information in a more efficient manner. So basically this first step, the describe question, is what people need to answer, and also starting to think about what mode to make image accessible in. The Diagram Center worked with Touch Graphics, which was a subcontractor on this project, which you will be able to kind of very small tree in a screenshot of in the on the PowerPoint right now, but please takes a user through a series of questions that answers whether or not an image description is required and the best way to do it. And what this particular segment of the training module does is there's a gallery of 8 different examples, and what a user can do is pull up the example, and I'm going to switch over right now and show you what that looks like. Oops. Arlene, I might need a bit of help on this one. Is it in the, oh, here we go. So share application, and I'm going to switch over to, sorry, that was the wrong place. Share application.
Do you want to share your entire screen?
Yes. So are you able to see that now? The Poet image description tool, is that sharing?
It's kind of flashing on and off and not really showing. It's black now.
Oh, okay. Let me try again. Is that doing it?
No, it just doesn't want to come across. And Christian's saying it looks like a Jabber chat room. It's not. It's
I
just
think
not.
I shared the wrong. Here we go. There we go. Does that
Perfect.
work?
Yeah,
okay.
That's great.
Okay, so on the Poet website, there's sort of this when to describe section, and this is the flowchart that I was just talking about, where there's a lot of key questions that need to be answered when somebody is addressing whether or not an image description is required. And I'm just having a little bit of trouble exiting out of this with the share mode. Sorry about that. So let me go back. And then basically what happens on this training module is below there's 8 different gallery items, and when you bring one up, it will take you, rather than go through the flowchart and trying to figure out yourself, it'll prompt you with a series of questions as to whether and you would answer, and I'm just going to go through it really quickly, and then at the end it'll basically summarize your responses to the prompted questions, and it's dynamic depending on what you ask or answer. It'll change the next question, and then there will be sort of a comment from the expert at the bottom which gives a recommendation on what best to do with making that particular example accessible. So that's already available on Poet, and I'm going to go back now to the sorry, having a little bit of trouble with this. Okay, and then so that's the first section of. Are we back on to the PowerPoint?
Yes, you are.
So basically that's a summary of what the image description training module is at, what stage it's at today. And what we're trying to build out is also the questions of how to describe. So this is all prototypes that are not yet there, and we're going to be adding, we're actually working on it with our engineers right now. So Brian's going to be very excited to hear about all this. So one of the additional areas that we're asking is also just basic description guidelines that people need to know. So when you address any type of image, there are some basic fundamental things that need to be considered. So things like your context, your audience, your language, and also common layout and sort of formatting characteristics of an image. So for example, you might have a key or a legend in a bar graph, but it might also be in a line graph or a scatter plot, right? Or even a pie chart, something like that. Or you might have different layouts where there's a particular image that spans multiple choice or multiple pages. What do? Those are things that commonly come up, and so we wanted to kind of give people a basic introduction to the things that you need to consider when addressing and approaching description writing for any image. So that's sort of one section that we're building out. So again, it's going to be an interactive website where you could pull up different examples from the gallery, and then it will give you sort of best practice guidelines in summary, bullet points, an example of an image that you could try out, and then there will be multiple choices at the bottom and actually interactive. So as you pull up different responses, it'll give you feedback. So this is currently in development. We really just started it, so these are all paper prototypes, and this will be probably early 2016. So I would just kind of keep following the Diagram Center website to look for updates on when this is available. So we'll probably be releasing it in smaller increments, but it is a lot of content. So probably I would say the first or second quarter of 2016. And you're welcome, Sonia. And again, these are the different categories that we worked out with Brian to really figure out what are those general guidelines, the image. And then on the next screen is the gallery. And Brian was pretty much working on this, I don't know for how long, but we basically got a lot of feedback from different image slams from volunteers saying, well, I have all these different types of diagrams that I don't have best practices for. So even things like cartoons and photographs and illustrations and drawings, what do you do about things like that? It's not even necessarily STEM, but it commonly comes up in liberal arts and different textbook content. So what we did was we worked with NCAM to expand out the different categories and types of images and the best practices and examples that go with them. So on this particular screen, what's available, and again, this will probably be ready in the first or second quarter of 2016, is an example of a drawing and painting. So again, guidelines, and then an ability for people to practice actually drawing and writing a description for this drawing and painting, and then you would then get feedback of an example from an expert, who is basically Brian, as an example that you can compare your description with the best practice description. And so this is also additional work that we've done with touch graphics, where there are certain types of images, so bar charts, Venn diagrams, pie graphs, where there's actually, we found that you could almost create a form that people could fill out and then automatically generate a description. And that way, a lot of the key elements are addressed. So for a bar graph, for example, there are key elements that's basically you want to address in every bar graph. You want to ask if there's a title, if there's a caption, what the X and Y axes are, what their labels are, and what the values are, and you fill in the information. So by prompting these key questions, people can basically enter in different things rather than have to worry about creating the actual text to address every single one of these. And then you would then go back and you can do some slight modifications and edits of that auto-generated text. But at least that way, the key elements are all covered. And that way, people who are maybe new to it know what key elements to address rather than having to read through every single bullet point. In best practice, we basically just give them a form to fill out. So this, again, is going to be part of the expanded image description training module that we're working on. So this next list is, there's a couple of lists where on the left is the original 10 or so different categories that NCAM had created in image types. And then on the right is how we basically expanded it to group them as categories, so it's just easier to identify, and then the specific image type that falls underneath those categories. And I see a couple questions, which are great, about badging and potential certification upon completion. This is actually one thing that we have been thinking about. We're not there yet. We're just trying to build out the tool, but we have talked to various publishers actually, and content authors and assistive technology, alt media folks who have asked about that specific question, where they're saying, you know, I want to get certified, or I want to show that I've gone through the entire training. This is something that we are looking to possibly expand into, but it's sort of, we're trying to build out the resource first, and then we're going to see if there's a lot of demand for that, and assess at that point again if there is a broad need for that and request for that. So, but definitely a possibility that we are considering once we get this out in the open. Yes, exactly, one step at a time. So that's where we are with Poet. And again, Brian's going to be able to go into a lot more depth about the actual writing of the complex image descriptions and the approach, which is always amazing and great to hear from him. But I'm going to actually move beyond image descriptions and talk a little bit more beyond text-based, and talk about additional modalities that are also increasingly used or being researched as ways to make content accessible. So alternative image access modes, this particular page shows various different types of content and ways to possibly make them available. So we might have things like 2D tactile graphics. There's something called sonification, which basically uses sound to reflect a particular image or diagram. So in this particular case, you would have a parabola that is upward facing. So the sound would go from high to low and back up again. So it would be like, right, to reflect the direction and the motion of a particular diagram. There's also different markup languages that we've mentioned. So there's things like markup languages specifically to address math content or music content. We talked about text descriptions. There's also, in addition to tactile graphics, there's haptics, which is basically almost like traditional paper tactile graphics, but in a tablet or digital form, whether or not, you know, you would want to be able to get feedback as you're working with a tablet. And then also 3D objects as well. That's another area that's just growing a lot of interest with folks. So these are just some examples of alternative ways to access images, and all things that Diagram Center and the community is looking to really provide more resources and best practices for. So the next page is basically introducing something called the Accessible Image Sample Book. I'm not sure if folks have heard of this, but this is also something that the Diagram Center Content Working Group produced, and basically it's addressing that last page. So there are certain types of images and diagrams where, you might have, for example, an atom, that carbon atom, where you could produce it as with text descriptions. You could also do a 2D tactile graphics. You could also do a 3D object. There's a few different options that maybe that are available to make that particular content accessible. And basically, the Accessible Image Sample Book collates a variety of different images and talks about how to go about making the best practice options for making those specific types of images accessible. And it explains why and how you would do so. It gives commentary as well as code snippets. So sample code of an example and maybe the EPUB and DAISY code that you would actually go about to make that content accessible if you were to, let's say, add it into an EPUB 3 or DAISY file. And the sample book is open source. It's available for everyone. It is on the more technical side, so it's really for people looking into more technical specifications. It is available at the Diagram Center as a document. You can also download the EPUB 3 book and all the different resources attached to it. And there was also a webinar that the Diagram Center put on in 2014 that originally talked about how this idea came to be. So we're currently on version 2 of the sample book, which came out in May of 2015. But the concept and the idea behind it is still very similar in the fact that we're trying to present different options and explain when you would make images accessible in those alternate formats. So that's the Accessible Image Sample Book. Highly encourage folks who are curious to take a look. And then, so in that sample book, I'm just going to address the themes that are touched upon. So for math, there's something called mathematical markup language. So this is a special markup language for math content and equations in particular. On this screen is actually a Poet math editor. So the idea is math equations in textbooks are often displayed as images. And so, again, it's not available for someone who is blind or perhaps has low vision who needs to zoom in and things begin to pixelate. So one of the projects, which I'm not diving into specifically here because I know this group has had a few different talks on math accessibility, is there's a MathML Cloud project that Benetech worked on, and basically it's to work with publishers to make sure that math is made available. So whether that means, in this particular case, if an image is retained as, or an equation is retained as an image because a reading tool or browser can't support MathML, then what would happen is one would, and this is in the Poet editor, one would go in and transcribe the math equation, and basically you would get a text description that's automatically generated off of the transcription. So again, people don't have to go in and say, oh, how do I explain this? And maybe have different standards and wording for describing images with math equations, but basically have this automatically generated for you. So that's one option. Another is for people who have rights. So we're working a lot with publishers on these types of content and content authors who have copyright rights. The idea is they could transcribe the equation, and then they could also take the MathML or they could take the SVG, and that's a more accessible format of the math equation rather than the original PNG or JPEG image. So if you want to learn more about MathML Cloud, I'm going to just type that in to the web, the chat. That's another place that you can take a look. I'm not going to go into it too much today just because we're talking more about images, but feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that tool as well. And again, so this is sort of what math, the challenges behind math that we're trying to address. There's visual rendering challenges where browsers might not display a math equation properly, losing a lot of the symbolic notation and the permutations and functions that surround it. So for example, on the far right, the browser 3, the fractions are all lost. Subscripts are lost, various key symbols and attributes are lost in equations. Or on the far left, this is actually PNG, where if someone has low vision and you're trying to zoom in, there would be pixelation. So MathML Cloud and the tools that we're building to promote MathML are really trying to address different types of scenarios. And then on the next screen, I'm not sure if this is going to work, so I might have to play it separately, is oral renderings of a particular equation. So I'm going to actually just, and let me know if you're able to hear this, where here is the voiceover reading of a particular equation.
F left parenthesis A right parenthesis equals 1 over 2 pi I, end of fraction, contour integral, subscript gamma, fraction start, F left parenthesis Z right parenthesis over Z minus A, end of fraction, easy, with 8 items. Math.
So that's the voiceover rendition. Here's Orpheus rendition.
A equals 1, 2, pi, I, comma, F, Z, Z, minus, A, B, Z.
So similar to what was, thanks Marlene for letting me know. So similar to how in the visual rendering there is a lot of gaps and inaccuracies, in the Aura rendering it has similar issues, and these are the types of things that we're up against, where we're talking about special notations and equations that maybe need to be made accessible in a different way. So one of the things that I did want to share with this group, and I think would be interesting, is as a result of people saying, well, you know, we are starting to see more and more content being produced in a born accessible way for math, people started asking, well, you know, what do I do with those files? If I have a web page, or I have an EPUB or a Word doc with MathML markup or LaTeX markup that is actually accessible in content source, what can I actually use as a browser, a reading device, and using various AT technology to access that particular information? So hearing a lot of that type of feedback, earlier this year we prototyped, and it's still very much in beta, so I definitely caution everybody in terms of when you do want to go and access and I'm just going to type it in the page as well for the chat. When you do go to the website, there is possibly information that's not totally correct, and we're still trying to figure out how we're going to maintain and sustain the quality of the data and add more to it. But the idea is, this is a user-based tool to help individuals and AT folks and alt media specialists really identify what those unique setups are that support reading of math in an accessible way. So this is not to say we're going to show you every single combination that's available, including things that are not supported, because there's a lot of combinations out there that we know that don't support reading math in an accessible way. Visual rendering is not sufficient. This is really additional accessibility access modes for reading math content. And I'm not going to do the demo, but I will show on the next, oops, oh, that is, oh, sorry about that. I am going to show the demo then. So I will go and share application again. Okay. So here, I'm going to go to msf.mathmlcloud.org. And basically what you can do is you can browse for all the different setups that are supported. Right now, looks like there are close to 32. And what happens is, and this is including my administrative view where I can see different things that are possibly not, I'm going to actually log out and give you a different view. So these are the I'm about to share is the tests that we have done so far, and some of it's partially tested and partially, and some of them are fully tested. And again, technology is constantly changing, so it will need to be maintained. But the idea is, if I was to go in here, I might say, well, I don't really care what browser and reading application I necessarily need, but I know I am, for example, a JAWS user. So for assistive technology, I would filter for JAWS and do my search. And then on the other end, you would see that there would be 5 results. And these are 5 results. Some of them are tested and some of them are partially tested. But the idea is you could then see for JAWS, there are options to read math accessibly on IE and Firefox. And again, versioning and your platform or your OS also matters. But it would give you the specific combination that you would require to access math in an accessible way. So for example, the second row is telling you use Windows 7, JAWS 16, which came out April 2015 and later, Firefox desktop, and for HTML file format, these are native renderers, so you don't need to install anything else, and then the outputs that you would have are speech and visual. If I go to details here, it would give you specific information, sample files of HTML that maybe you could download and test for something else. When it says required renderer, what does that mean? Native, that means no additional plugin are required. MathML is being rendered natively by your reading application. And then on the bottom of the page has specific details about access modes. So when we talk about speech and visual accessibility, it actually goes into a second tier of details, which is, okay, well, if we're talking about visual, are we talking about HS displays? Are we talking about focus highlighting? Are we talking about zoom magnification? And if you need to, you could click into any one of them. There is a definition under the notes section in the details where you can drill down farther and understand what it means when we talk about zoom magnification for visual versus tactile or braille or oral. So that's what Math Support Finder looks like. I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so that is the Math Finder. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is 2D tactile graphics. So again, this is a example from the sample book where it basically just gives an example of what a tactile graphic would look like. This is the heart and lungs, and what it would be when it was produced as a 2D tactile graphic. It is the actual embossed paper version as well as an accompanying text to explain how you would navigate that particular file. And so that's 2D tactile graphics. There's also emerging technology in haptics. So this is basically for tablet-based technology. So we're trying to see, there's a lot of research in this area as to what else can be done. But in these two particular screenshots, there are two separate examples. On the left is basically a table. And within the table, column B, the value 240 is highlighted in green. And what one would experience using a tablet is that when you click on the 240, you would get vibration feedback. And basically, it's kind of, if you think about haptic technology, it's similar to when your phone vibrates or when you're playing a video games, you get feedback from the device that you're using. So in this particular case, when it's 240, it might vibrate or give you kind of taps really quickly. But then in column C for 12, it might be a slower pace, like a slower pulse of feedback. So basically it can highlight different values in a table. That's one way to use haptic technology. Another is on the right, there is a geometric image of a square. And so in this particular case, you might be teaching a student what different basic geometric shapes feel like or are shaped. So if one were to take their finger and go around the perimeter, it would basically give you, again, haptic feedback. So it vibrates as you're going around the perimeter of a square or a particular shape so that you can feel what that feels like in a tablet-based digital environment. So those are different technologies in 2D tactile graphics. 3D objects is another area where people are just having a lot of interest in. There's so much benefit to 3D technology, and actually on the next slide, I'm going to share with you a video of a particular student who let me just pull it up and prepare it. Who basically was experienced, who's a PhD student who's experiencing or learning basically physicist, and she is trying to understand what a particular shape, really complicated shape, I think it's called like a saddle parabola or something like that. I don't even really know very well, but the idea is that she's trying to understand what that shape sounds like. So I'm going to just play this video and let you all experience it. Are you able to see the screen with somebody, the video screen on right now?
Move your left hand a tiny bit to the perfect. Now this one, give or take, that's its proper orientation. Right? It's not especially important, but you can what the maximum feels like.
Yeah.
So when she's talking about a maximum, she's talking about something that feels like that.
Oh, cool.
Catch what I'm saying? Okay, now a little bit further to your left is another graph. I'm going to have to hold it in place a little bit. That's what a minimum feels like. You catch what I'm saying?
Oh, this is so cool. I don't know, it just, seeing them actually in the third dimension just brings the math so much better.
Cool.
So that was, Chelsea actually did a TED Talk, so that is available there as well. Let me just go back to, oops. Okay. So that was Chelsea interacting with 3D technology, and you can see yeah, Chelsea Cook, exactly. You can see how powerful that tool really is. Sorry. I mean, Diagram Center is working a lot with various organizations to make 3D technology a bit more widely. There's a lot of different types of content that is particularly beneficial, especially when we're talking about really odd shapes or things that are, biology, for example, is a great place where a lot of the scale of things or the sensitivity, it's hard to just kind of place a heart in somebody's hand and play with it. So being able to sort of recommend, break apart if you had a 3D object and interact and explore that object is just a very powerful tool. And the thing that's great about a lot of these different types of emerging technology that we're applying in education is that if we think about this particular case with Chelsea, I know personally myself, if I was learning this back in high school, these shapes and these concepts are really difficult to grasp when we're just kind of looking at it in a 2D dimension. As you have more resources available, it's really something that everybody can benefit from. A lot of universal learning and design, a lot of just multimodal learning, it just has a huge potential impact for various types of learners. So yeah, definitely a great TED Talk and great resource that we're looking quite a bit into at the Diagram Center as well. And then so one of the challenges around this is, okay, there's so much great technology. Where are we moving with all of this? And so this is kind of a sneak preview into what's coming up next, which is things like diagrammer content models. So as more and more technology emerges, like with 2D and 3D tactile graphics, we actually have to be able to link that back to the original textbook or source document, right? So Diagrammer, and this is also actually, we're using Poet for various things for prototyping and proof of concept. But basically, if we had that textbook again, and we were to pull up a textbook and there's an image there, there would be ways Diagrammer content model basically allows you to access and say, okay, well, I would prefer to actually see a simplified description versus maybe a summary description or very detailed complex description. So depending on the audience and user needs, you could have different tiers and levels of vocabulary for the descriptions. And then you could also say, okay, well, I want to, instead of just accessing the text description, I want to access the tactile graphics, and I want to have the description of how I explore this tactile graphic model to access this particular content, right? So as people are coming up in a particular book or source file, they need to know when to link out to these related materials. So Diagramma Content Model basically gives you that option to basically to go out and access those materials. And so one place what we've already started to kind of experiment with this is actually, with different testing methods, and so you could access tactile graphics in 3D. And then other things that we're working on is interactive content widgets. If you want to see in this particular example, this is something that the Diagram Center again worked on, and there's an accessible slider that you can access. The link is on the slide at the bottom, but basically what happens is there's a slider above a bar graph, and you could slide it and the numbers will change, and then on the right side there's a speech log where it actually gives you the specific values as it's changing. So as these are just additional things that people are exploring. So really, I mean, that's where we are with image accessibility. There are a lot of just reminders that image accessibility is really, really challenging, especially as we get to more modes of making images and diagrams accessible. This is something, this particular chart that I pulled up is one of the partners that we've worked with from a museum, actually, and they're talking about visual literacy. And the stages of visual literacy start with going from looking, observing, seeing, and then progressing on to interpreting, analyzing, and describing. So if you find, or you have found, that describing images is really difficult, this is particularly why. It is probably one of the final stages in their visual literacy program that basically progresses through how you would go about understanding images and diagrams, and this applies to educational content as well. And then the thing that's particularly challenging about this is that when we started with visual literacy 5 years ago, we were really talking about text description. So I have an image of concentric circles here where the smallest circle on the inside is text, right? But as you grow in, say, tactile graphics, there's visual literacy, and there's the specifications on how you go about producing an effective tactile graphics. It's not just a straight reproduction. And then it grows when you get to 3D objects, because they're adding yet another dimension. And then we have all this new emerging technology and alternative access modes that are continually coming up into this particular space. So it's really a very difficult and challenging task that we're all trying to address. And so it's just kind of a reminder, don't get distressed, that it is still very difficult to do, and we understand, and we completely commiserate. And then on the next slide is really talking about what Benetech and the Diagram Center is really trying to do with all of this type of newly emerging technology. And really what we're doing is we're building, 5 years ago, we started with NCAM and various partners to really start building awareness around accessibility, to really get people interested and review and assess the importance of accessibility and get attached to making things accessible. And then we're gradually, over time, we started to build a lot of tools like Poet and Mathemacloud and Math Support Finder, things like that, where and all these different guidelines as well, right? Not just tools, but best practice documentation around how. So how do we make these things available to people and to actually start implementing it? So it's sort of this progressive stages of adoption, and what we're trying to do, and continually in the next 5 years, we will continue to try to do this under the new Diagram grant. And then this is just across the comic strip where this is, again, just reminders of when people start, you have early innovators and early adopters where they're just trying to figure things out and testing things and working out kinks. And a lot of times at that point, after you have the early adopters, you fall into this chasm where it's hard to fall to kind of jump over, but thereafter, that's where you get sort of more and increasing adoption of early and late majority, and people eventually get to just more accepting technology and new access modes as something that's broadly used and shared. That's basically where we are, and basically if anybody has questions, I also have a list of different references that we mentioned throughout this presentation. So there's a lot of Benetech related and Diagram Center links, as well as image descriptions and tactile graphics, both 2D and 3D. There's also recently, earlier, I think it was in September, we came out with a 3D quick start guide as well. So starting to address how to go about and when to use 3D graphics. There's also 2D graphics resources from BANA, as well as tactile graphics how-to from the tactilegraphics.org. So that's basically all I have, and I haven't left too much time for questions, but if anyone has questions at this point.
So, Sue-Ann, I do have permission from you then to share this PowerPoint out along with your recording on the Montana Accessibility Interest Group website, I'm assuming?
Yes.
So all this information, especially this reference page, will be available to all of you early next week. Sue-Ann, that was just really, really fantastic. And I love what I'm seeing in the chat there. It sounds like...
Great.
Yeah, I do. You mentioned Brian's work, and Brian Gold. I wonder if you might mention. You'll be speaking to us in February, and I was wondering if both of you might talk about that upcoming complimentary presentation.
Hi, sure. Thanks for having me on. It's Brian Gould from the National Center for Accessible Media at WGBH, and we are a partner in the Diagram Center and have been. And I'm going to come in in February and talk about effective and efficient practices for creation of alt text or image description for complex, often STEM-based images, and also alt text for use in assessments, which of course is different than alt text used in instruction. And all of this work is based on what became a series of research and development projects that were funded by both the National Science Foundation and the Department of Ed into best practices for describing images. And we found some very interesting things, which I'll be excited to share with you in February.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to that. These resources are really, really incredible. It's great to see all the new developments that are coming down the pike, Sue-Ann. And I'm hoping that you possibly in a year or so will join us again and give us another update on where you're at.
Yeah, it's been fun working on all these things, and every year we kind of actually we did something similar, Accessing Higher Ground, last year, and so every year this is actually a great time. I would love to come back and speak and give an update on how things are progressing.
Great. And for those of you that aren't aware of Accessing Higher Ground, that conference is November 18th, 19th, 20th, and it's very affordable to get the virtual version of that conference. I think it's $420 for tracks A and B we stream it here in our building for anyone on the campus. And I know your presentation will be streamed, so looking forward to seeing another repeat of this presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, and if anyone is interested in chatting more about any of these different tools, we're looking for people to help with maintaining and developing some of these tools too. Feel free to email me. I just added my email in the chat room as well. So MathML Cloud is definitely a resource that people are looking into. Math Support Finder, we're looking to build out that particular resource, and it seems like it's something that a lot of the alt media folks are interested in. So if you're interested in doing pilot tests with us or contributing work, please feel free to reach out.
Great, thanks. I know we will be reaching out to you.
Sounds good.
And I see Sonia has a question for you.
Platform. You can use, so I think I was just on Chrome. It works on Chrome and Firefox. So it works on Safari as well. Probably Chrome is going to be the one that works the best. Oh, how is it built? So Poet is a Ruby on Rails. The tool itself is Ruby on Rails tool. Does that answer your question? Okay. Great. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's a minute past the top of the hour. I know you have another meeting to get to, Sue-Ann. So thank you very much for joining us. I really, really appreciated all this information, and we hope to stay in touch with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good Friday.
Yes. Happy Friday.